Well, good morning, everyone. I wanted to welcome you to Trinity's webinar discussing the 2016 Subpart W reporting rule update. My name is Patty Senafani. I am a senior consultant with Trinity. I work with the regulated community, including much of the oil and gas industry. I joined Trinity in 2008, and I'm based out of the Pittsburgh office. Just a couple of housekeeping items for today's call. Just to let everyone know, phone lines are currently muted, but we do want your involvement. Please feel free to submit questions via the webinar. When you do that, please address those to Mary Galley, and we will follow up with you after the webinar. Also, please feel free to email us any questions or call at any time, and we'd be glad to help. Also, a copy of the presentation slides will be made available for all the folks that dial in today. Just a quick note regarding today's presentation. The Subpart W reporting form that we will be talking about is a draft version. EPA has not finalized that yet, so we may see some changes in the final version of the form. And also, as always, air quality regulations are pretty dynamic, particularly for oil and gas. So all the information in here is based on our best and current understanding. So things we'll be talking about today, we'll be doing a brief introduction to Trinity consultants for those of you that may not have worked with us so far. We'll talk about those Subpart W updates that are effective for the 2016 calendar year. We'll walk through some of the changes to the Subpart W reporting form. That form's still draft. We'll provide some updates on API's Sangia emission calculation tool, as well as talk about some potential areas of exposure based on your greenhouse gas report under NSPS OOOOa. We'll also talk a little bit about some changes for 2017 in the Subpart W reporting rule and provide you with some helpful resources for your reporting efforts. So Trinity Consultants, founded in 1974, one person, one office in Dallas, Texas, air quality specialty. Over the past 40 years, we've really broadened the environmental consulting services offered while still maintaining that air quality focus. We're also a ISO 9001 quality management certified, and that allows us to provide those consistent, high-quality deliverables that Trinity is so well known for. Here's a look at the map of our office locations. We have over 45 offices, which really allows us to be local everywhere. This allows not only us to have expertise in the federal rules, but in the state and local rules as well, and to also have a deeper understanding of local industries. And kind of echoing that local everywhere philosophy, here's a look at some of the folks in Trinity's oil and gas team. We can list them all here. There are more, but this will provide you a good list of places to get started if you need to reach out to us. So just a couple of notes about greenhouse gas reporting in general. All the information that gets reported through e-GGRT is publicly available, and EPA makes it fairly easy to access that information. So just keep in mind what your greenhouse gas report could be indicating about your operations, have an idea of what your emissions trends look like, as well as maybe a comparison with other similar operations. All those greenhouse gas reports can be accessed online. We've provided the link, so if you want to take a look at those. That link will take you to EPA's flight website, which will allow you to access emissions data, as well as the actual reports themselves. This here is just a screenshot from the system. I've kind of cut off the information to the right, but you can see the type of information. It can be rolled up pretty easily when folks access those reports. This is not only the emissions, but also the types of fuels used, the number, like for this particular example, was the production industry sector. So we're showing the number of wells, number and types of pneumatic devices, as well as the top 6 emitting sources in that report. This is just a quick look at 2014's Subpart W data and how that has rolled up to show the % of emissions by sectors reported. Now we'll see some changes when 2016's graph is prepared, because that will also include the new sectors, gathering and boosting and transmission pipelines. So we'll start talking about these changes to the rule that were effective January 1st of this year. Those rule updates were finalized on October 22nd of 2015. They do include new sources subject to reporting for the first time. And as all greenhouse gas reports, those reports are due no later than March 31st each year, covering the previous calendar year. So the Subpart W updates that we'll be talking about today include updates to onshore production segments, which expands the greenhouse gas reporting requirements to also include oil wells, completions and workovers from oil wells with hydraulic fracturing. And it also requires reporting of certain well level information by the well ID number. Or the API number for that well. These changes also include 2 new segments to be reported, and that's the onshore petroleum and natural gas gathering boosting sector, as well as natural gas transmission pipelines. So the onshore production sector changes, as I mentioned, this is going to include now well venting emissions during completions and workovers with hydraulic fracturing from oil wells. And that would be for any well with a gas-oil ratio greater than 300 standard cubic feet per stock tank barrel. Previously, this requirement in the sector only included gas wells. So the rule updates include additional instructions on how to calculate gas-oil ratio for this purpose. The 300 SCF threshold was added into the rule as a result of industry comments, basically to address the fact that oil wells with gas-oil ratios less than that threshold don't generally have sufficient gas to operate a separator. The other changes including the well identification number or the API number. And the basis of EPA adding this was for greater transparency in reporting and also improved data quality. So some of the language updates we see in the rule to implement these changes are just some language updates, changing gas well to gas well and oil well, clarifying flowback as gas flowback, and clarifying that it's not just gas well venting, but venting during all well completions that meet the criteria. There's also a new equation, W12C, and this is for oil wells where the gas production rate is not metered. Equation 10B also includes some additional language where EPA is clarifying where gas flowback should be measured. Basically, they're saying that that recording flow meter is on the vent line downstream of the separator, but ahead of the vent or flare. Gathering and boosting is a new sector to be reported for the first time in 2016. So just a little bit of background on that. In the past, any equipment located off a well pad with commingled streams that didn't fall into a different reporting sector has basically been excluded from greenhouse gas reporting. EPA recognized that this was a gap since the program began back in 2011. And some of the equipment types that were basically exempted based on this was tank batteries not located at well pads, or compressor stations not located at well pads, and also not meeting the processing sector definition. Certain compressor stations or other facilities that didn't meet the processing definition were sometimes reported under Subpart C, but generally only if that facility triggered more than 25,000 metric tons of emissions from combustion. So we'll take a little bit of time in the next few slides to talk about what the gathering and boosting sector is comprised of. There's a couple of paragraphs we'll look at from the rule. We recommend that you get familiar with these just to understand the segment definitions. So the onshore petroleum and natural gas gathering and boosting segment is the gathering pipelines and other equipment used to collect the petroleum and natural gas from production wells, used to dehydrate, sweeten, and transport the gas or petroleum to either the processing facility, transmission pipeline, gas distribution pipeline. Now, an onshore gathering and boosting system is a single network of pipelines, compressors, and process equipment used to serve that purpose. So it's essentially taking the gas from the production sector to the downstream endpoint at where the next sector begins, whether that be processing, transmission, or distribution, or possibly another gathering and boosting system. The term facility with respect to gathering and boosting includes all the gathering pipelines and other equipment under common control by the gathering and boosting system operator in a single basin. So what this means is that you could have multiple gathering and boosting systems be one facility for the purposes of reporting if they're located in the same basin. The last sentence in the facility definition clarifies that EPA didn't intend to double count any equipment. So if the equipment is already a part of another sector that gets reported for greenhouse gases, it's excluded from the gathering and boosting sector. So to take a look at what that means, we have to have a good understanding of the upstream and downstream sectors. We'll take a look at production first. In this figure, we have shown within these squares the production equipment subject to reporting. And production, for the purposes of this rule, is equipment located on or associated with a single well pad, and it's located in a single basin. So essentially, it produces these little islands of production equipment within the basin that are all summed up to total one facility. On the left, we can see that there are 3 individual wells, each where their stream is transported downstream to a point where they're commingled and enter the gathering and boosting sector, and within the square is the production sector. In the next example, we have 3 wells, again, transporting their gas to a point where they're commingled. But also we have liquids from these wells going to different types of tanks. The first tank is a tank associated with a single well, but it is not located on a well pad. But because it's still associated with a single well, it falls in the production sector. The next tank example receives liquids from 3 different wells. However, this tank is located on a single well pad. Since it is located on a single well pad, it still falls within the production sector. And then lastly, we have 1 tank receiving streams from 3 separate wells, and that tank is not located at a well pad. And that means that that is not a part of the production sector. Take a look at this figure, which is basically what we're calling a segment determination waterfall, to kind of help step through the decision-making process of which sector a particular piece of equipment will be reported under. So we just talked about production, and that's equipment located on or associated with a single well pad. Next, we'll talk about processing, and there's a multi-step process in determining if the facility is processing. We want to determine whether or not separation is occurring at the site, and if fractionation is or is not occurring, and the throughput for that facility. We'll talk about that next in more detail. The next site or sector on our waterfall is the gathering and boosting sector. So this is the equipment in the gathering pipeline system that moves the commingled product from production to the downstream processing, transmission, distribution systems. Other segments to consider when you're looking at where your equipment should be reported is transmission compression sector, underground natural gas storage, LNG storage and import and export, natural gas distribution, as well as transmission pipelines. So if the equipment falls under one of those segments, it would not also fall under boosting and gathering. So let's take a look at the decision-making process for determining whether or not a facility is part of the processing sector under Subpart W. Now this differs a little bit from what EPA has put into other rules. So we want to look at specifically the Subpart W definitions. The first question that we need to determine is whether or not separation is occurring at the facility. So under Subpart W, separation includes not only forced extraction of natural gas liquids, but also sulfur and carbon dioxide removal. as well as fractionation of NGLs and capture of CO2 separated from natural gas streams. So if any of those activities are happening, then separation is occurring. If not, then that equipment may be part of the gathering and boosting sector, and that should be evaluated. So if we determine separation is occurring, the next question we need to answer is whether or not fractionation is also occurring. If so, then it is a production facility or a processing facility. If fractionation is not occurring, we need to look at what the annual average throughput of the facility is. If the annual average throughput is greater than 25 mmSCF per day, then the facility is a processing facility, and it's not a gathering and boosting facility. If the throughput is below that threshold, then this equipment is not processing, but should be considered as whether or not it's part of the boosting and gathering sector. So one important thing to keep in mind with that last question is that it is possible for a particular facility to transition back and forth between processing and boosting gathering on a year-to-year basis, depending on the facility throughput. So we want to look at what the reporting thresholds are and how they differ between processing and gathering and boosting, keeping in mind that we may have to reevaluate sites on an annual basis for that determination. So gas processing facilities must trigger the 25,000 metric tons of CO2e as a single facility to trigger reporting. While the gathering and boosting segment triggers that same threshold as an entire basin. So all of the equipment in that basin summed up in comparison with the threshold. Now keep in mind that you do exclude the processing facilities from that total when you're comparing the gathering and boosting segment against the 25,000 metric tons. So some of the sources that are reportable under gathering and boosting include natural gas activated pneumatic devices, as well as pneumatic pumps, acid gas removal vents, dehydrator vents, blowdowns, storage tank emissions, flare stacks, compressor venting, equipment leaks from not only components like valves, connectors, and open-ended lines, but also equipment leaks from the gathering pipeline itself. And lastly, we report combustion-related emissions from stationary and portable sources in the gathering and boosting sector. So there's a couple of exclusions from gathering and boosting. It doesn't include, as we talked about, it doesn't include equipment that's already reported under another industry segment. Additionally, gathering pipelines operating on a vacuum are not included in this segment for reporting purposes. And lastly, gathering pipelines with a gas-oil ratio less than 300 standard cubic feet are not included in this industry segment as well. Now, the rule doesn't go into detail regarding the gas-oil ratio for gathering pipelines, but EPA has published a frequently asked question that you can find on their website. And they reference the gas-oil ratio definition from the NSPS regulations. And they provide some information on how gathering and boosting sector may use the best approach for determining gas-oil ratio and what they consider as options. Direct measurement, calculation from other measured data, standard estimation methods, as well as using a value that's already calculated for some other business reason that should be allowed for determining what the gas-oil ratio is. And next we'll talk about the transmission pipeline facility definition. So with respect to transmission pipelines, it is the total of the U.S. mileage of all natural gas transmission pipelines under common ownership that defines the facility. So that's a new definition, and it's the total of all the U.S. mileage. The transmission pipeline equipment may trigger greenhouse gas reporting if it emits more than 25,000 metric tons of greenhouse gas. Then it is subject to reporting. So when we do that calculation, we are looking at the total U.S. mileage of pipelines owned and operated by the company, and we aggregate those even if those pipelines are not interconnected. For this sector, we're going to report pipeline blowdown emissions from blowdown vent stacks. And EPA has classified those transmission pipeline blowdown events into 8 separate categories. So when we report those emissions, we will report them based on the category listed here. So next, we thought it would be helpful if we just took a minute to talk about the online reporting tool, e-GGRT. For folks that have not had to report an e-GGRT before, you may need to set up a new user account. If you have a CDX account login, you can start with that, but we will need to still log into e-GGRT and register as a user, enter your profile information, print and sign an electronic signature agreement that gets sent in hard copy. And then after EPA reviews, they'll send an email back with instructions on how to activate your e-GGRT account. So once you have an e-GGRT account, you may also need to register a new facility. So when you register that new facility, you put in the facility information, but you also need to assign for each facility a designated representative and an optional alternate designated representative. And these will be the people that can actually certify and submit the greenhouse gas report. Once those have been assigned in e-GGRT, EPA will send out an email invitation to those individuals, which then they can log in and accept delegation as the designated representative. You also may appoint an agent in e-GGRT. Agents cannot certify or submit reports, but they can work in the system and enter the data. The designated representative or alternate designated representative goes into e-GGRT. They appoint an agent. EPA reviews that request. They send the agent an invitation code, which they then accept and send back an electronic signature agreement. Then the designated representative needs to log back into e-GGRT to sign the notice of delegation for that agent. So just keep in mind that this is a multi-step process that could take a little time, especially if you're doing more than one facility. So you may want to do this early so that you don't have to deal with this while you're working on the reporting efforts themselves. For those facilities in gathering and boosting that may have triggered reporting under Subpart C, they may already have a facility ID in e-GGRT. But due to the differences in the facility description and how that facility is defined in the two subparts, it does cause a little bit of an issue with how that facility might be set up. So Subpart W, we're reporting gathering and boosting on a basin level. So it's that total of all equipment within the basin. For Subpart C, we were looking at more of the true contiguous facility when comparing against the applicability threshold. So we may need to register a new facility in e-GGRT. If a company had only one Subpart C reportable facility in a basin, EPA has said that they may use that same e-GGRT ID to report for Subpart W, but it could lead to some confusion on emission trends because anything prior to 2016 would just be combustion related, and from 2016 beyond would be the full gathering and boosting sector. So it may be easier just to set up a new facility ID. For companies that have more than one facility that reported in a basin under Subpart C, they definitely need to set up a new facility in the system. And once you have that new facility set up, you no longer want to report under the original Subpart C ID number, and there is a place within e-GGRT where you can just kind of check a box and let EPA know, you know, this site is now part of the gathering and boosting sector and will be reported under a separate ID. So we'll look at the Subpart W reporting form next. EPA posted a draft version of the reporting form in September of this year, and they accepted comments until sometime in October. One form is submitted per industry segment. The forms are Excel spreadsheet format that do get uploaded into e-GGRT. The little screenshot shown here on this slide is on the first tab of the report where we're indicating which industry segment this workbook is going to cover. So each facility gets its own individual Excel workbook. And you can see the two new fields added for gathering and boosting and transmission pipeline. Now, once you've selected the sector on that list, you'll see the table below will automatically populate and show which tabs within the workbook are required to be completed for that sector. So for this example, I selected, we can see the yeses indicate which tabs will need to be completed. The red text here just shows some differences from this list from last year. We can see that the facility overview tab has been split. Onshore production now has its own facility overview tab. Completions and workovers was also split to be two tabs, one with and without hydraulic fracturing. EPA has clarified that the storage tank tab is not only production, but it's the atmospheric storage tanks from both production and gathering and boosting. And they've added in the gathering and boosting sector for combustion-related emissions. So the new onshore production facility overview tab, it has the same sub-basin characterization table that we've seen in the past, where we list out on a sub-basin level the number of wells producing at the end of the year, number of wells divested, acquired during the calendar year, as well as the greenhouse gas composition for that sub-basin. Now, there's a new table of what we're calling well level characterization information. And this is where we're going to list out the well ID number. And we're also going to, again, list out for that specific well, if it was producing at the end of the year, divested or acquired during a calendar year, taken out of production. So this is a new requirement, more detailed on a well level. The same table is also going to include the well level information for the categories listed below in the following bullet points. Liquid unloadings using calculation method number 1. Well venting during completions and workovers with hydraulic fracturing, as well as without hydraulic fracturing. Well testing and venting, flaring, and associated gas venting and flaring. So they also added a table to the facility overview tab to collect information on the gathering and boosting sector. So it reports the basin that the facility is in. This is a screenshot of that table, and because the type is a little hard to read, we also have the information reiterated on this slide. So we've got the basin, the amount of gas received, the amount of gas transported to the downstream sector, as well as the hydrocarbon liquids received and transported to the downstream sector. So you may already be tracking this information, but just keep in mind we'll need to roll it up on a basin level when it gets reported. Okay, similarly, the transmission pipeline sector has a new facility overview table. This is just a screenshot of that. And the information that EPA is collecting for transmission and pipeline in this table includes the natural gas received from all custody transfer stations for the transmission pipeline sector, gas withdrawn from in-system storage, gas added to in-system storage, natural gas transferred to third parties, such as the distribution or other transmission pipeline sectors. We're also going to report the gas consumed by the transmission pipeline facility for operational purposes. And we're going to report on a state-level basis the associated miles of transmission pipeline in each state. A couple of minor changes to the tabs and tables for reporting AGR units and dehydration units. On both of these, we have a new field for gathering and boosting facilities to enter the county and state level information. So within that basin, we may be reporting on the emissions in the specific county and state, breaking that down into those smaller units. Calculation method 2 and 3 on the acid gas removal unit, EPA just provided an opportunity to clarify the units for the volume of gas vented, whether that's actual cubic feet or standard cubic feet. Additionally, for dehydrators, the larger dehydrator category, Using calculation method 3, we have a new field that we will be able to report the unit ID name when we're including any missing data that was occurred during the reporting period. Right, form updates on completions and workovers with fracturing. We're going to focus mostly on that new well characterization table. So when you're working through the completions and workovers tab, it will link you back to that first tab for this well characterization table. And depending on which equation you use when you report will depend on what information needs to be included. There's also some general information collected, whether or not it was a completion or a workover, the well type, if gas was flared, whether it's an oil or a gas well, and the equation that's used. When you're using equation 10A, EPA wants to know whether or not this particular well is subject to the 2-year delay allowable for wildcat or delineation wells. Also, they want to know the measured average flowback rate for the well in standard cubic feet per hour. If you're using equation 10A and equation 12C for oil wells, you're going to report the gas-oil ratio as well as the volume of oil produced during the first 30 days of production. For equation 10B, the information that goes on this table is the flow volume vented or flared, as well as the flow rate at the beginning of the period of time when sufficient quantities of gas are present to enable separation. So that's in standard cubic feet per hour. For completions and workovers without fracturing, the well characterization table asks just a few simple questions, whether it's a completion or workover, if it's been flared or vented to the atmosphere, and the remaining information is reported as usual on the completions and workovers without fracturing tab. The well characterization table also has fields for well testing and associated gas venting, as well as the information that would normally be collected on those individual tabs. So for the well characterization, we will have, of course, the well ID number, but also the equation used to calculate the gas emissions, whether those emissions are vented or flared. For reporting of blowdowns, we see a couple of changes to the reporting tab. This tab will include boosting and gathering as well as transmission pipelines. So they get reported on the same tab, but the form, depending on which sector you choose, way back in the beginning on the first tab, it will gray out or black out cells that don't apply to your sector. The top two tables are going to address how the emissions are calculated. There's two options. One, calculated by equipment or event type, where we're using the unique volume of the vessel and the number of events. And the other table and other option is the use of flow meters measuring total blowdown emissions. When we complete these two tables, we will report for gathering and boosting on a basin level basis. So we're putting totals in for the entire basin. When we use the equipment event type, there'll be a drop-down menu for gathering and boosting to select for the allowed event types. So I believe there's 7 that EPA has determined are applicable. For transmission and pipeline, there's a separate drop-down menu for the 8 types of blowdown events that are reported. Also keep in mind for transmission, we're rolling those emissions up on a U.S. level, so it's the total of all transmission pipelines. Additionally, for transmission pipeline, EPA is asking for the emissions by state and the number of blowdown events by state. Atmospheric tanks, there's just a few changes to this tab to incorporate gathering and boosting. So the production and the gathering and boosting sector will get reported on this tab. Transmission storage tanks have a separate tab. It did not have any changes for this version. Production is reported on a sub-basin level. For gathering and boosting, this information is reported by county and state. A lot of the changes that we see on this tab are language clarifications, just to indicate that it's not simply tanks located at the wellhead or associated with single well pads. The draft form also had some clarifying language that we didn't see in the prior versions of the form. And this is for the tanks that fall into the less than 10 barrels per day category that are using method 3 calculation methodologies that also flare emissions. So EPA is just clarifying here that the volume of gas flared should be the volume of gas calculated using the equations from Subpart W. And when you do this, you assume that that volume only has CO2 and CH4 as the components in the flared gas. So for compressors, major change we see for the sectors that we're talking about today are just clarifying that both onshore production and onshore gathering and boosting compressors are both reported. And it's just a screenshot from 2 of the tables relevant to those sectors. So today we also wanted to give you a brief update on the Sangia software. For those of you that do not know about API Sangia, it is been developed and maintained by Trinity. It's a desktop application, very user-friendly. You can import and export tools from Excel. It also has options for calculating criteria pollutants. Trinity is in the process of evaluating the changes needed to pull in these 2016 reporting form changes. And we're doing that based on the draft version. So we will wait until the final version of EPA's reporting form is released before we release the updated version of Sangia. We expect that to be in February of 2017. If you'd like any additional information about Sangia, we've got an email address here. Please feel free to reach out. All right, well, with our greenhouse gas reported data, we just wanted to also take a look at, how that may be interpreted, keeping in mind NSPS Quad O and Quad OA. One of the first things that comes to mind is that we're reporting completions and workovers with hydraulic fracturing. We're putting them on with well ID numbers. So we may want to also compare that against Quad OA annual reports, where we're also listing out all the completions and workovers with well ID numbers. I want to see, how do these two lists match up? And if they don't, just understand why. Similarly, some of the information that we're going to be reporting, for example, with completions and workovers with hydraulic fracturing, may raise some questions when we look at Quad OA. This is just our our interpretation. We don't know that EPA is making these comparisons, but we're just aware that the information will be out there and available. But for completions and workovers with hydraulic fracturing, we are reporting, depending on which calculation method used, but we're reporting the time the gas was vented or flared after a separator could operate. So when we think about Quad O and Quad OA, and we have limitations on the separation flowback stage, we just want to make sure why we understand why that well vented or flared. If it was exempted and allowed to do so, or if it's a deviation that maybe we reported on our Quad OA report. Also, when we look at compressors, particularly for natural gas transmission sector, we're reporting under greenhouse gases the unique ID for each compressor, as well as the compressor driver horsepower output. Now, the implication under Quad OA could be that if we see an increase in compressor driver output in the greenhouse gas report, that possibly a modification occurred that would have triggered NSPS Quad OA LDAR requirements, or the leak detection requirements. Quad OA notes that if an additional compressor is installed, or one or more compressors are replaced by one or more compressors with a greater horsepower, that a modification has occurred, and the facility should be subject to the leak detection requirements of the rule. A couple of other changes that we wanted to mention on greenhouse gas reporting will be effective January 1st of 2017. And these relate to equipment leaks. So in 2016 and prior years, the rule really uses one of two approaches, depending on your sector, to calculate equipment leak emissions. The first method is the leak survey method, and we've listed out the sectors that use that methodology as well. And the second approach is the population count, where we're using population counts and emission factors, and that's for production and gathering and boosting sectors. Now, how these are going to change in 2017, on November 10th, 2016, EPA administrators signed additional rule amendments. They are pending publication in the Federal Register, and we expect them to be published as early as tomorrow. So we may see that in tomorrow's Federal Register. These changes are effective January 1st, 2017. And then that will be for the report that is due in March of 2018. The changes relate to the leak detection methodology, and it's to align better with NSPS Quad O. So facilities will be able to use the results of their NSPS Quad OA required fugitive emissions monitoring to fulfill the Subpart W monitoring. And there will also be an option for companies to voluntarily use that method as well. So we'll use the data collected during the leak surveys, as well as some new emission factors in the amended rule to calculate those emissions. And lastly, we just wanted to provide a few helpful resources for when you're working on your reports. Definitely your local Trinity office is a tremendous resource. Please do not hesitate to reach out to us. The EPA's Greenhouse Gas Help Desk, we've provided the email address as well as the phone number. You can submit questions there for both the rule as well as questions related to using e-GGRT. I will note that the email is probably the better method of contacting them. Keep in mind that anything that you submit to that help desk is public information. So just be careful that you're not sending them any confidential business information. We've also included a link here for Subpart W's frequently asked questions. EPA updates these periodically, and they have them categorized not only by Subpart W, but also by sector to help navigate those. The latest reporting forms can be found at this link. Please note that the 2016 forms are not on there right now. Based on the timing of last year's reporting form release, we wouldn't expect to see those until potentially end of January, early February. Well, I just wanted to take a minute to thank you all for your time today. Again, today's slides will be provided. You'll receive a webinar survey via email, so just complete that survey and return it. You'll be on the list to receive the slides. Appreciate your time, and please do not hesitate to reach out to either me, Georgette Reeves, the director of our oil and gas business line, or your local Trinity office, and we'd be glad to help. Thanks again. Have a great afternoon.